What if I told you that a wooden boat, a mountain range in the Middle East, and a totally bizarre specific date on an ancient calendar mathematically predicted the exact weekend of Christianity's most important event, like centuries before it happened?
I mean, it sounds like the setup to a conspiracy thriller. Or, just a massive historical coincidence.
Right. But when you start stacking these coincidences on top of each other, dozens of them, hidden in a text that's thousands of years old, the math just breaks down. You move past coincidence into something that looks suspiciously like deliberate design.
Which is exactly what our source material today is arguing. We're looking at a text that behaves as if its ultimate author exists, well, entirely outside of our constraints of time.
Welcome to this deep dive into the source material. We're unpacking a fascinating, really towering stack of study notes and research focused on the book of Genesis. And I want to be absolutely clear right off the top. Our mission today is not to just, recap ancient history.
Yeah, we aren't doing Sunday school character summaries here.
Far from it. We are looking at Genesis as an integrated message system, like an architectural blueprint that sets up the entirety of the human experience.
Exactly. We're going to discover how this text practically equips you, yes, you listening right now, to dissect and resist modern philosophical dead ends.
Yeah, and we're going to pull out some incredibly gritty, practical lessons on what faith actually looks like in the real world through the lives of these deeply flawed, messy patriarchs.
And going back to that hook, we're going to uncover how Genesis hides a stunningly detailed portrait of Jesus Christ, woven into the narrative thousands of years before he ever walked the earth.
It's wild, because when you look at your own life, you are fundamentally trying to answer four basic questions, whether you realize it or not. Who am I? Where did I come from? Why am I here? And where am I going?
Right, and how you answer that second question, the origin question, the Genesis question, it dictates the framework for how you navigate every single aspect of your reality today.
Because, if you believe you're merely a cosmic accident, a random collision of atoms, your reality, your ethics, your sense of purpose, they all look one way.
But if you believe you are designed, that you have a specific intent behind your existence, the world looks entirely different.
And this is the concept from the research that absolutely stopped me in my tracks. The Old Testament is essentially the historical account of a nation, but the New Testament is the account of a man.
Yeah.
And according to this material, the New Testament is entirely concealed within the Old.
Augustine actually framed this perfectly centuries ago. He said the New Testament is in the Old Testament concealed, and the Old Testament is in the New Testament revealed.
Wow.
It implies that the events, the people, the geography, the rituals, they aren't just historical footnotes. They are deliberate prophetic foreshadowings.
It's like watching a psychological thriller where the twist ending retroactively changes the meaning of every single scene, every line of dialogue that came before it.
You want to go back and rewatch the whole movie because suddenly the clues were there the entire time.
Exactly. But to understand how this ancient text actually pulls that off, we have to start at the very beginning. The first four words in the English translation, it's the ultimate philosophical line in the sand.
Because you can't really analyze the actors on the stage until you understand how the stage itself was built.
Okay, so let's unpack this opening sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's incredibly simple. It's elegant. But our sources make this massive claim that this single sentence supposedly dismantles every major secular philosophy before the argument even begins. Now, I have to push back on this.
Sure.
If I'm an atheist, I hear that sentence and I just say, well, it's a fictional story. You haven't defeated my worldview. You've just read me a fairy tale.
Yeah.
How does this text structurally defend itself?
That's the crucial distinction. The text isn't trying to argue with the atheist in a debate format. It's establishing the structural axioms of reality.
Like math.
Think of it exactly like mathematics. Genesis 1.1 is the foundational equation. It anticipates every major philosophical deviation mankind would invent over the next several millennia, and it systematically denies them their premise.
Walk me through how it actually does that.
Let's start with atheism, like you mentioned. Atheism says there is no God. Genesis 1.1 doesn't offer a 5-point philosophical proof for God. It simply asserts him as the primary causal agent. God created.
Right, so if the text is true, atheism is void.
But it goes much deeper. Take pantheism. This is a very popular philosophy, even today, under different New Age names. It's the belief that the universe itself is divine, that God is the tree, the ocean, the cosmos.
The whole idea that we are all a piece of the universe experiencing itself, that kind of thing.
Precisely. But Genesis says God created the heavens and the earth. That introduces the concept of transcendence. God is distinguishable and entirely separate from his creation.
So the painter is not the canvas.
The programmer is not the software. That completely obliterates pantheism.
And what about polytheism? Because we have to remember the context here. When Moses was compiling this, the Israelites were surrounded by the Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Babylonians.
Oh, absolutely. All of these cultures believed in a chaotic pantheon of gods constantly at war with each other.
The sun god fights the river god, and humans are just, caught in the crossfire.
Exactly. And against that backdrop of cultural noise, Genesis asserts monotheism with total authority. God created singular. It attributes the existence of the universe to one God acting with a singular unified purpose.
No celestial civil wars, just sovereign will.
Right.
It's incredibly subversive for its time. But what about materialism? Because this is the philosophy that dominates much of our modern era. The idea that matter is eternal and the physical universe is all that ever was and all that ever will be.
Materialism is defeated by those first three words, in the beginning. Genesis explicitly states that matter, time, and space had a starting point. They are not eternal.
Which, fascinatingly, is a concept that modern astrophysics only really caught up to in the 20th century, with the discovery of the expanding universe. Before that, many secular scientists just assumed a steady-state, eternal universe.
They did. So if matter isn't the ultimate reality, that also challenges humanism, right? The idea that mankind is the measure of all things, the supreme authority in the universe.
Because if God is the ultimate reality and the creator of all things, then man is a created being. We're answerable to a higher authority. We aren't the authors of our own moral universe.
And finally, the single verse counters unguided evolutionism and uniformitarianism. The idea that the universe just slowly unfolded through blind, uniform natural processes over deep time.
Because the text insists on deliberate, intelligent intervention.
Yes, it presents a creation ex nihilo out of nothing. It was spoken into order by an external intelligence. It didn't accidentally arrange itself.
Okay, let's hover on that point, because our sources dedicate a massive amount of ink to contrasting this biblical view of creation with the secular alternatives. And it gets deeply into the hard sciences here.
It really does.
We all know the secular models, the Big Bang or the nebular hypothesis, which suggests our solar system formed from a swirling, cooling cloud of gas and dust. But the research critiques these unguided models using the laws of thermodynamics, specifically entropy.
Yeah, entropy is a massive hurdle.
Break that down for us. What exactly is entropy, and why is it such a problem for unguided evolution?
Well, entropy is a measure of disorder, and the second law of thermodynamics dictates that in any closed system, entropy always increases. In simple terms, the universe is winding down. Things naturally move from order to disorder.
Heat dissipates. Machines break.
Biological organisms decay and die. Think about your house. If you don't actively put energy and intelligent effort into cleaning and maintaining it, it doesn't spontaneously organize itself into a pristine mansion.
Definitely not. It gets dusty, the roof leaks, things fall apart.
It requires an external source of energy and intelligence to maintain order. But macroevolution requires the exact opposite of the second law of thermodynamics. It requires matter to spontaneously move from chaotic disorder to incredibly complex, highly specific order, entirely on its own, without an intelligent external energy source guiding it.
It requires the universe to be winding up.
Exactly.
So the classic counter-argument you always hear to that is, well, the Earth isn't a closed system. We have the sun. The sun pumps massive amounts of energy into the Earth, and that energy drives the evolutionary process.
It's a common argument, but it completely misses a fundamental reality of physics. Raw energy alone does not create functional complexity. In fact, raw, unguided energy usually destroys complexity.
How so?
If you introduce raw solar energy into a system, say, leaving a plastic toy out in the hot sun, or ultraviolet radiation hitting a human cell, it breaks down the molecular bonds, it causes cancer, it causes decay.
Right, to harness energy, you need a mechanism.
You need a highly complex mechanism already in place, like the process of photosynthesis in a plant leaf. That captures the raw solar energy and converts it into organized, useful work.
But where did the complex mechanism of photosynthesis come from in the first place? You can't use the sun to explain the origin of the very biological machines required to process the sun's energy.
Precisely.
That leads perfectly into an analogy in our sources that I thought was brilliant. We've all heard the traditional watchmaker argument. You're walking in the woods, You find a pocket watch lying on the ground. You open it up, see the gears, the springs, the perfect alignment.
And you immediately know a watchmaker made it. It didn't assemble by a random collision of minerals over a million years.
Right, the classic teleological argument. Design implies a designer. But the research takes this a massive step further, which just blew my mind. They compare the watch to the wrist it sits on.
It's such a good point.
Because a watch, for all its intricate gears, is actually a very simple, open-loop, dead mechanical system. But your wrist is a biological marvel. It has closed-loop feedback systems. It has veins constantly pumping nutrients. It has white blood cells autonomously identifying and destroying foreign invaders.
And if you cut your wrist, it literally deploys cellular scaffolding to repair its own tissue.
Exactly. It's essentially self-updating biological hardware. If the relatively simple dead metal of a pocket watch absolutely demands an intelligent designer, how could anyone logically conclude that the infinitely more complex, self-repairing biological system of the wrist was cobbled together by random chance?
It's mathematically absurd. And this connects directly to information theory, which is where the modern scientific debate is truly centered. The source material presents an empirical test that sounds almost like a joke at first, but it delivers a devastating point about the origin of life. They call it the peanut butter jar test.
I laughed out loud when I read this in the notes. Please explain the peanut butter test, because I need everyone to hear this.
Okay, so the scientific term for life originating from non-living matter is abiogenesis. Unguided evolution fundamentally relies on the assumption that, at some point, lifeless chemicals spontaneously arrange themselves into a living cell. So the empirical test is simple. Go to the store and buy a new sealed jar of peanut butter.
Okay, I'm with you.
Inside that jar, you have matter. You have a rich soup of proteins, fats, and amino acids. You also have energy, as the jar is exposed to heat and light. So you have matter and you have energy. You open the lid. Does a new spontaneous form of life crawl out of the peanut butter?
If it did, I would immediately burn my house down and never buy peanut butter again.
We all would. The entire global food industry, every canning factory, every pasteurization process relies on the absolute scientific certainty that spontaneous generation does not happen. You cannot get life from just mixing matter and energy.
So what's the missing ingredient? If matter plus energy doesn't equal life, what's the third pillar?
The third pillar is information. To get life, you need the digital, complex, specified code of DNA. DNA isn't just a chemical. It is a literal language. It has syntax. It has an alphabet. It contains the instructions to build eyes, lungs, and neurological networks.
And the foundational law of information theory, going all the way back to scientists like Claude Shannon, is that information only ever originates from a prior intelligence.
Matter and energy cannot write code.
Never. A random explosion in a printing press doesn't produce an encyclopedia. Wind blowing through a junkyard doesn't assemble a Boeing 747.
And a warm puddle of chemicals, no matter how much lightning strikes it, cannot write the four-dimensional biological software of DNA. Code requires a coder.
And when you zoom out from the microscopic code of DNA to the macroscopic scale of the universe, that coder seems to have fine-tuned our reality to an impossible degree. The sources bring up the Anthropic principle.
Yes. The Anthropic principle is the observation by physicists that the universe appears perfectly, delicately rigged for human life to exist. There are hundreds of incredibly precise physical constants. The strength of gravity, the electromagnetic force, the ratio of electron to proton mass.
They call them the dials of the universe.
Right. And if you reach over and adjust any one of those dials by even a microscopic fraction of a percent, say, altering the strong nuclear force by 1 part in 10 to the 55th power, the entire universe collapses. Stars wouldn't be able to form. Carbon wouldn't exist. The universe would be a dark, lifeless void.
It's like walking into a massive recording studio, finding a soundboard with 100 different sliders, all perfectly, exquisitely balanced to produce a symphony, and assuming the studio cat just happened to walk across the board and step on the exact right sequence of knobs.
It strains credulity.
So when we absorb all of this, the information in DNA, the fine-tuning of physics, the philosophical defiance of the first verse, what is the ultimate conclusion the sources draw about the nature of God?
The conclusion is that the Creator is completely outside of our time domain. We tend to think of God as just a really old guy with an infinite amount of time on his hands, but time itself is a physical property. It's intimately linked to mass and gravity, as Einstein proved. If God created the physical universe, he created time. Therefore, he sits outside of it.
He's not bound by the timeline. He's looking at the whole parade from the Goodyear blimp.
Exactly. And because he is outside of time, He is uniquely capable of writing a message into human history that declares the end from the beginning. He can embed authenticating watermarks into the timeline itself to prove that the message is from him.
Which brings us to the tragedy of the fall. Because once this incredible, perfectly fine-tuned universe is established and humanity is placed in it as the image bearers, things immediately go wrong.
Yes.
In Genesis chapter 3, we see the rebellion of Adam and Eve, and this brings sin, death, and what the text profoundly calls the bondage of decay, which is essentially spiritual and physical entropy into the picture. The perfect system fractures.
It's the ultimate catastrophe. The actors decide they want to overthrow the director.
But the fascinating thing is that God doesn't just abandon the project. He doesn't wipe the canvas clean and start a new universe.
Yeah.
Immediately, while the dust of the fall is still settling, Genesis introduces a hidden blueprint for a rescue mission.
God begins laying down prophetic breadcrumbs. In theological terms, the research refers to these as types or similitudes.
Let's define that for the listener, because typology can sound like academic jargon. What exactly is a type in this context?
Think of a type as a historical foreshadowing. It is a real historical event, a real person, or an object that God sovereignly orchestrates to serve as a prophetic picture. It's a three-dimensional model pointing forward to the ultimate fulfillment, which is the future Redeemer.
Okay, here's where my mind was completely blown. Jesus himself actually told the religious leaders of his day, "Moses wrote of me." Now, Moses is the credited compiler of Genesis, but if you read Genesis cover to cover, the name Jesus never appears, not once. So how exactly is Christ showing up in these ancient narratives?
The sources detail 7 specific, stunning typological events and figures early in Genesis where Christ's life, death, and mission are clearly foreshadowed. And it starts immediately after the fall, Genesis 3.15. Theologians call it the proto-evangelium, the very first gospel.
Set the scene for us. God is handing out the consequences.
Right, God is pronouncing judgment on the serpent, on the woman, and on the man. But tucked right into the middle of the curse on the serpent is an incredible promise. God tells the serpent that the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head, while the serpent will only bruise his heel.
The seed of the woman. That phrasing always struck me as odd because in every biblical genealogy and all of ancient Near Eastern literature, ancestry is traced through the male line, the seed of the man.
Exactly. Biologically and culturally, referring to the seed of the woman is an anomaly. This is a subtle, incredibly early hint at a virgin birth. It's a promise that a coming Redeemer will be born of a woman without a human father. He will take a painful blow, the bruising of the heel, representing the crucifixion. But in doing so, he will deliver a fatal, crushing blow to the head of evil itself.
The ultimate Pyrrhic victory for the serpent. That's the first type. But the very next one happens just a few verses later in Genesis 3.21, the garments of skin. So Adam and Eve realize they are naked, they are exposed in their guilt, and what's their immediate reaction?
Their instinct is self-preservation. They sew fig leaves together to cover themselves.
Which is the perfect metaphor for human religion. We realize we are morally exposed, so we try to cover our shame with our own efforts. We sew our little fig leaves of good deeds or charity or philosophy, hoping it's enough to cover the guilt.
But the text shows us it's entirely inadequate. Fig leaves dry up and blow away, so God steps in. He strips away their human works, and he clothes them with coats made of animal skins. Now, I want you to think about the mechanical implication here. In order for Adam and Eve to receive those garments of skin, what had to happen?
Something had to die. Innocent animals had to be slaughtered.
Exactly. Blood had to be shed. Right there, at the dawn of human history, God establishes the foundational mechanism of biblical redemption, the concept of substitutionary atonement.
Let's slow down and explain the why behind that mechanism. Because to a modern listener, the idea of an animal sacrifice sounds primitive, maybe even barbaric. Why does innocent blood cover guilt? What is the logic?
The logic goes back to the Creator's initial warning, "In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." Sin is fundamentally a rebellion against the source of life. Therefore, the natural consequence, the wage of sin, is death, separation from life.
Right.
God is perfectly just, so the penalty must be paid. But he's also perfectly merciful, so he introduces the concept of a substitute. An innocent life is given in place of the guilty. And because the life of a creature is in its blood, the shedding of blood represents a life poured out to satisfy the debt.
So God is visually demonstrating to Adam and Eve, your works won't cover you, the penalty of death must be paid, but I will provide the innocent substitute to cover your shame. It points like a laser beam straight to the cross.
It's the entire gospel in a single prehistoric act.
Unbelievable. Okay, that brings us to the third type. And this is the one from our intro that deals with the math and the dates. The Ark of Noah.
Most people look at Noah's Ark as just a Sunday school story about a boat and some animals. But structurally, the Ark is a physical vessel of salvation, coated in pitch to keep the waters of judgment out, providing safe passage for those who take refuge inside it.
The Apostle Peter actually refers to it directly as a prophetic picture of salvation.
He does, but the detail that truly proves the outside-of-time authorship is the chronology.
Walk us through the calendar dates. Let the awe of this really breathe for a second.
In Genesis chapter 8, verse 4, Moses records the precise day that the ark finally came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, signaling the end of the judgment and a new beginning for the earth. The text says it was the 17th day of the 7th month on the ancient calendar.
A very specific detail to include.
Now hold that date. Centuries later, in the book of Exodus, right before the first Passover, God tells Moses to completely rearrange the Hebrew calendar. He declares that the 7th month is now to become the first month of their religious year, the month of Nisan.
So the anniversary of the ark resting on the mountain is now mathematically Nisan 17.
Correct. Now fast forward over 1,000 years to the New Testament. Jesus of Nazareth enters Jerusalem. According to the Gospels, he is crucified on Passover. Passover, by Jewish law, is the 14th of Nisan.
He dies on the 14th.
He is placed in the tomb, he is in the grave for 3 days, the 15th, the 16th, and he rises from the dead on the 3rd day, the 17th of Nisan.
The exact same calendar date.
The exact same calendar date that the ark rested on dry ground, signifying the earth's rebirth from judgment, is the precise day that Jesus Christ walked out of the tomb, signifying humanity's rebirth from spiritual death.
You can't just chalk that up to coincidence. I mean, a human author writing Genesis thousands of years earlier could not possibly have coordinated the calendar date of an execution method crucifixion that hadn't even been invented yet under a Roman Empire that didn't yet exist.
It is an author outside of time putting a watermark on his manuscript.
It gives me chills. Let's move to the fourth type, because this theme of types doesn't just apply to events or objects, it scales up to specific people. In Genesis 14, we meet a figure named Melchizedek.
Melchizedek is a fascinating anomaly. He is the priest king of Salem, which is the ancient name for what would later become Jerusalem. He comes out to meet Abraham after a major military victory.
And he just kind of drops into the narrative out of nowhere. There's no backstory.
Which is entirely against the rules of Genesis. Genesis is a book obsessed with genealogies. So-and-so begat so-and-so. But for Melchizedek, the text records no genealogy, no birth, no death. He appears entirely without origin.
Why leave his family tree out?
The author of the book of Hebrews explains why. By deliberately omitting his genealogy, the Holy Spirit designed the text so that Melchizedek would serve as a prophetic type of Christ's eternal priesthood.
Oh, I see.
An order of priesthood not based on human lineage, like the Levitical priests who came later, but based on an indestructible life, a priest forever. And the detail of what Melchizedek brings out to Abraham is staggering.
He brings bread and wine.
Bread and wine. Thousands of years before Jesus sits in the upper room in Jerusalem and institutes the Last Supper, saying, "This is my body, this is my blood," here is the priest king of Jerusalem bringing those exact elements of communion to the Father of the faith.
The structural integrity of this book is just staggering. Okay, type number 5. And this is perhaps the most emotionally crushing and famous story in early Genesis. Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah in Genesis 22.
The parallels here are so dense, you almost need a magnifying glass. God tells Abraham to take his son, his only son whom he loves, and offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain God will show him.
We have to imagine the psychology here. God has promised Abraham that a great nation will come through Isaac, and now God is saying, kill him. It's a massive crisis of faith. And the text notes they travel for 3 days to reach the mountain.
That 3-day journey is crucial. Hebrews tells us that Abraham fully intended to obey because he reasoned that God was capable of raising Isaac from the dead to keep his promise. So in Abraham's mind, Isaac was essentially dead the moment God gave the command. And 3 days later, Isaac is received back alive when God stops the sacrifice. It's a prophetic picture of a 3-day death and resurrection.
But the physical details on the mountain are what really mirror the Gospels. When they get to the base of the mountain, Abraham leaves the servants. And what does Isaac do?
Isaac, who, by the way, is not a helpless little boy here.
Yeah.
The timeline suggests he's a young man, strong enough to carry enough wood for a massive fire, willingly carries the wood for his own sacrifice upon his back up the hill.
Just as Christ, the ultimate beloved son, carried the wooden beam of his own cross up the hill. And when Isaac asks where the lamb for the sacrifice is, Abraham says God will provide for himself the lamb.
It's chilling in its precision. And to cap it off, it's not just the objects that are typical, it's the geography. The text specifies they are in the region of Moriah. Centuries later, King Solomon would build the Jewish temple on Mount Moriah.
Okay.
And sitting right on that same geological ridge is a specific elevated peak called Golgotha.
The place of the skull, where Jesus was crucified. It's the exact same zip code. The geographical stage was set 2,000 years in advance. Let's look at the sixth type. We move from Abraham down to his grandson Jacob.
Genesis 28. Jacob is fleeing for his life from his brother Esau. He's exhausted, he stops for the night, uses a rock for a pillow, and falls asleep. He has a profound dream.
The famous Jacob's ladder.
He sees a ladder or a stairway set up on the earth, and the top of it reaches into heaven. And he sees the angels of God ascending and descending on it.
It's a beautiful image, but how exactly does that point to Jesus? I don't see the direct connection there.
You don't have to guess the connection because Jesus himself claims the imagery. In the Gospel of John, chapter 1, Jesus is speaking to a man named Nathanael. And Jesus looks at him and says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man."
Wow. Jesus is claiming to be the ladder.
He is the fulfillment of Jacob's vision. He is declaring that he is the sole mediator, the only physical and spiritual bridge connecting a holy God in heaven to a broken humanity on earth.
Which brings us to the seventh type in our source material. We've looked at events, objects, geography, and individuals. Now we look at the royal lineage. Genesis 49:10.
Jacob is at the end of his life. He is an old man lying on his deathbed in Egypt, and he is pronouncing prophetic blessings over his 12 sons, who will become the 12 tribes of Israel. When he gets to his son Judah, he makes a massive structural decree.
He says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes."
A scepter is the symbol of royal, kingly authority. Jacob is prophesying that the right to rule will reside permanently in the tribe of Judah, and he says it will remain there until Shiloh comes.
Shiloh.
The word Shiloh translates roughly to "he to whom it belongs" or "the peacemaker." It's an ancient, universally recognized messianic title.
So it establishes the precise genetic lineage that leads directly to King David and ultimately to Jesus, who the book of Revelation calls the Lion of the tribe of Judah.
Exactly. So if you step back and look at these 7 types, you realize these are not retrofitted interpretations by overeager Christians centuries later. These are structural, narrative, geographic, and chronological design features planted in the text thousands of years in advance.
It's indisputable evidence of a master architect. But here's the profound irony that our source notes pivot to next. While these prophetic pictures, these types, are utterly flawless in their design, the human men used to paint them were anything but flawless.
This brings us to section 3 of our deep dive, the Patriarchs. God entrusts this massive cosmic rescue plan to a very specific and deeply, shockingly flawed family line.
And this is where the text gets incredibly practical for you and me. Because I think we have a tendency to view these biblical figures like marble statues. We call Abraham the father of the faithful. But if you actually sit down and read his story without the Sunday school filter, the guy is a mess.
He really is.
He repeatedly lies about his wife to foreign kings to save his own skin, letting her be taken into their harems. And when God promises him a son, and he gets tired of waiting, he tries to force the issue by sleeping with his wife's servant, Hagar. I have to ask, how is this guy the model of faith?
Because the Bible, unlike almost every other ancient religious text, is ruthlessly and brutally honest about human nature. It doesn't sanitize its heroes. Abraham's journey is a masterclass on the internal war between the flesh and the spirit.
Unpack that dynamic for us, because that tension seems to define his whole life.
The sources highlight this perfectly with his 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael is the son produced by Abraham's own scheming, his natural strength, his flesh. He tries to assist God to make the promise happen on his own timeline.
Right.
Isaac, however, is the son produced entirely by divine promise, born miraculously when Abraham and Sarah were practically ancient, representing the spirit.
And whenever we try to use our human efforts, our human scheming, to assist divine promises, we just create a colossal mess. The conflict between the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac is literally still dominating global headlines today.
Exactly. But the theological hinge of Abraham's life, and really the anchor of the whole Bible, happens in Genesis 15:6. This is before Isaac is born. God takes Abraham outside in the dark, tells him to look up at the stars, and says, "So shall your offspring be."
And he has no evidence at this point.
He has no evidence. He has no son. He's an old man. But then the text gives us this incredible verse. He believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness.
That is massive. That is the foundation of justification by faith.
Completely apart from works. Notice what Abraham didn't do. He didn't offer a sacrifice right then. He didn't recite a creed. He didn't perform a ritual. He simply took God at his word. He trusted the promise. And God credited that trust to his spiritual bank account as perfect righteousness.
And we see that faith eventually mature, because the Abraham who lied in Egypt out of fear is not the same Abraham who later walks up Mount Moriah. We talked about Isaac's sacrifice as a prophetic picture, but look at it from Abraham's perspective. When he leaves the servants at the bottom of the hill, what exactly does he say to them?
He says, "I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and we will come again to you."
We. He used a plural verb.
It's the ultimate triumph of his faith. As we noted earlier, he reasoned that God could raise the dead. His faith had grown from a fragile, scheming reliance on himself to a man who could literally stare down death, confident that God's promise could not be broken.
It's a progression, and that should give tremendous hope to anyone listening who feels like their faith is weak or prone to failure. God works with the progression. But if Abraham's flaw was fear and impatience, his grandson Jacob is operating on a whole different level of dysfunction.
Jacob is fascinating. His name literally translates to heel catcher. In ancient idioms, it essentially means supplanter, or, more practically, a deceiver, a hustler.
From the moment he is born, clutching his twin brother Esau's heel, his entire life is defined by natural ambition. He's always looking for the angle.
He buys his older brother Esau's birthright for a bowl of lentil stew when Esau is starving. Later, he orchestrates a massive deception, putting animal skins on his arms to trick his blind, dying father Isaac into giving him the family blessing.
He steals the blessing, and his brother essentially puts a hit out on him. So Jacob has to flee the country.
He flees to his uncle Laban in Haran, and this is where we see the intense, poetic justice of God's discipline. Jacob, the master deceiver, finally meets his match. Laban is a bigger hustler than Jacob is.
Laban completely outplays him. Jacob works 7 years to marry the woman he loves, Rachel, and Laban pulls the ultimate bait and switch.
In the dark of the wedding tent, Laban substitutes his older daughter, Leah. Jacob wakes up the next morning realizing he's been conned. He gets a taste of his own deceptive medicine. And for the next 20 years, Jacob is manipulated, his wages are changed 10 times, and he is overworked by his uncle.
But the defining moment of Jacob's life, and one of the strangest, most profound scenes in all of Scripture, isn't his conflict with Laban. It's when he is finally heading back home 20 years later, and he knows he has to face Esau, the brother who vowed to kill him.
It happens at the river Jabbok, in a place Jacob names Peniel. He's terrified. He sends all his wealth, his wives, his children across the river ahead of him as essentially a human shield and a bribe. And Jacob is left completely alone on the riverbank in the pitch black.
And then, out of the darkness, someone shows up.
He is attacked. He wrestles all night with a man. But as the dawn breaks, the text makes it clear, and theologians confirm, this was the angel of the Lord. What we call a Christophany, a pre-incarnate physical manifestation of Jesus Christ.
Explain that term for the listener, pre-incarnate appearance. How is Jesus showing up as a wrestler in the Old Testament?
The term angel of the Lord in the Old Testament almost always refers to the second person of the Trinity appearing in physical temporal form before his actual birth in Bethlehem. God stepping into the timeline to interact directly with humanity.
So Jacob is literally in a fist fight with God, and he's fighting with all his natural fleshly strength. He is trying to wrestle a blessing, guarantee of safety, out of God.
Because that is the only way Jacob knows how to operate. Struggle, scheme, overpower, find the leverage. But God knows that if Jacob goes to meet Esau the next day operating in his own fleshly strength, he will be slaughtered. Jacob has to learn that he cannot scheme his way into God's provision.
So how does God break the hustler?
He physically breaks him. The angel reaches out and touches Jacob's hip socket, instantly dislocating it. Suddenly, Jacob's strength is entirely gone. He's crippled. He can no longer fight. He can no longer wrestle. All he can do is cling. He wraps his arms around the angel and says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me."
It's a total paradigm shift.
Mm.
He goes from wrestling in self-reliance to clinging in absolute desperate dependence.
And that is the moment God blesses him. That is when his name is changed. He goes from Jacob, the deceiver, to Israel, which means governed by God or a prince with God. God could only use him once he was broken of his self-reliance.
If you are listening to this right now, think about the practical application of that moment. How many of us are exhausting ourselves, wrestling with our circumstances, trying to force our own outcomes, trying to scheme our way to security?
The sources draw a brilliant connection to what happens immediately after this. Once Jacob has this spiritual breakthrough, his whole household has to go through a spiritual cleansing. God tells him to return to Bethel, the house of God. But before they can go, Jacob issues a strict command to his family.
He tells them to take all their strange gods, all their little foreign idols, their lucky charms, and bury them under the oak tree at Shechem.
They had to let go of their hidden safety nets. Those idols represented their backup plans. If the God of Jacob doesn't come through, we have these little household gods to protect us.
We all do this. We all have our personal idols under the oak tree. It might be our bank account, our career network, our own intellect. We trust God, but we keep a backup plan just in case. The lesson here is that to fully step into your purpose, to transition from a Jacob to an Israel, you have to bury your backup plans in the dirt. You have to commit to absolute dependence.
It is a painful but necessary surrender. And before we move past this family, there is a macro-theological point the source notes make here that is stunning. If you look at this lineage, from Adam to Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, God constantly, deliberately bypasses the natural order of things.
You mean regarding the firstborn sons?
Exactly. In ancient cultures, the firstborn son automatically inherited the spiritual authority and the double portion of the wealth. It was an ironclad natural law. But God repeatedly subverts it. He chooses Abel's offering over Cain's. He chooses Isaac over the older Ishmael. He chooses Jacob over the older Esau.
Why does God keep ignoring the established cultural rules?
To explicitly prove that God's election, his purpose, and his salvation are based entirely on sovereign grace, not on human merit, not on natural birthright, not on your pedigree or tradition. It's never about who culturally deserves it. God actively disrupts human tradition to ensure that the glory for salvation belongs entirely to him.
Which brings us perfectly to the absolute pinnacle of this theme, the idea of human failure and malice being completely overridden by sovereign grace. We are moving into section 4, the life of Joseph.
Joseph's story is the longest single narrative arc in the book of Genesis, and it is the ultimate synthesis of everything we've talked about today. Joseph is an almost unbelievably precise prophetic type of Christ, and simultaneously, his life is the masterclass for the listener on trusting God's providence through intensely dark times.
The irony of Joseph is that he feels like the only guy in this dysfunctional family who actually behaves. He's not lying to kings like Abraham. He's not tricking his dad like Jacob. He is faithful. He has integrity.
Well, look at what it gets him.
Exactly. His reward for being the good son is betrayal, being sold as a slave, being falsely accused of assault, and rotting in a foreign dungeon. So if you are a listener going through a totally unjust situation right now, if you are suffering and you did nothing wrong to deserve it, Joseph's story is your anchor. But before we get to the emotional payoff, let's look at the prophetic math. How exactly does his life map onto the Savior?
The sources we are studying note over 100 specific typological parallels between Joseph and Jesus. It's almost mathematical. Let's walk through the major milestones. It starts at home. Joseph is the beloved son, loved uniquely by his father, and given a coat of many colors, a mark of distinction and favor.
But his brothers absolutely despise him.
They hate him for 2 reasons. They hate him because of his words. He shares prophetic dreams where they're bowing down to him, and they hate him simply because of who he is, the chosen one.
Just as the religious leaders of the first century hated Jesus, they hated his teachings, his claims of authority, and they hated his identity as the unique son of the Father.
The parallel continues. Jacob, the father, sends Joseph out of the safety of the valley of Hebron to go seek the welfare of his brothers who are out shepherding the flocks. He leaves the father's side to go to his brethren.
And when his brethren see him coming from afar, their immediate response is to plot his death. Here comes the dreamer, let's kill him. They violently strip him of his robe of distinction, and they cast him into a pit.
And here's a detail that is so specific it defies logic. The brothers decide that instead of outright murdering him, they can make a profit. They decide to sell him to a passing caravan of Ishmaelites. Which brother negotiates the price?
It's Judah.
Judah negotiates the sale of his brother. He sells him into slavery for pieces of silver.
And when you translate the Hebrew name Judah into Greek, The language of the New Testament, the name is Judas. Judas Iscariot negotiates the betrayal of Jesus to the religious leaders for 30 pieces of silver. The historical rhyme there is devastating.
It's precise. So Joseph is taken down into Egypt. He becomes a servant in the house of Potiphar, an Egyptian official. He prospers, he acts with total integrity, but then he is falsely accused by Potiphar's wife.
And what does Joseph do when he is falsely accused? He doesn't mount a massive legal defense. He doesn't scream and protest.
He offers no defense. He remains silent before his accusers. Just as the prophet Isaiah predicted, the Messiah would be like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, and just as Jesus stood silent before Pontius Pilate, offering no defense against the false witnesses.
So the innocent, silent Joseph is condemned and thrown into the dungeon.
And while he is in the dungeon, he is numbered with two transgressors, two criminals who offended the king of Egypt, the chief butler and the chief baker.
Jesus is crucified between two thieves, two transgressors.
Exactly. And look at the fate of the two men in prison with Joseph. Joseph interprets their dreams. He predicts that in 3 days, one will be pardoned and restored to life, and the other will be condemned and face execution.
One thief on the cross mocks Jesus and perishes. The other thief asks for mercy, and Jesus promises him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." One receives life, one receives death. And again, Joseph predicts this will happen in exactly 3 days. The resurrection motif is everywhere.
It is inescapable. After a long period of suffering where Joseph is seemingly forgotten in the dark, the time comes for his exaltation. Pharaoh has dreams he cannot understand. Joseph is brought out of the dungeon, he interprets the dreams, and Pharaoh instantly elevates him. He takes Joseph from the prison and seats him at his own right hand, making him the supreme ruler over the entire known world.
Exalted from the pit to the throne, raised to the right hand of majesty.
And in the midst of his exaltation, Pharaoh gives Joseph a Gentile bride, Asenath.
Just as Christ, following his resurrection and ascension to the right hand of the Father, takes a Gentile bride to the global church. But what is the ultimate purpose of Joseph's exaltation? Why does God put him on the throne of Egypt?
Because a global famine hits. A devastating 7-year famine that threatens to wipe out humanity. The whole world is perishing. But because of God's providence, Joseph had stockpiled the grain. Joseph alone possesses the resources to save the world. He dispenses the bread of life to a starving, dying planet. He becomes the literal savior to all peoples, both the Egyptians, the Gentiles, and eventually his own Hebrew family.
It is breathtaking when you step back and see the entire architectural structure laid out like that. But as we mentioned, there is a deeply human, emotional climax to this story that packs just as much theological weight as the prophetic parallels. Because eventually the famine drives his brothers, the very men who plotted his murder and sold him down into Egypt looking for food.
And they don't recognize him. He is dressed like an Egyptian prince. He speaks to them through a translator. He is completely unrecognizable as the teenage boy they threw in a pit 20 years earlier.
But Joseph recognizes them, and he puts them through a series of intense tests. He keeps one brother hostage. He demands they bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, back to Egypt.
He is testing them to see if their hearts have changed. He wants to know if they're still the same treacherous, selfish men who sold him, or if they have learned loyalty. He specifically targets Benjamin, Jacob's new favorite son, to see if they will abandon him the way they abandoned Joseph.
And Judah, the same Judah who sold Joseph, steps up and offers to lay down his own life, to become a slave in Benjamin's place so the boy can go home to their father. He demonstrates substitutionary sacrifice.
It breaks Joseph. He sees the repentance. He cannot hold his emotions in any longer. He orders all the Egyptian guards out of the room. The text says he wept so loudly that the Egyptians outside heard it.
And he looks at these terrified men, and he drops the Egyptian facade, and he says in Hebrew, "I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live?"
You have to try to imagine the absolute paralyzing terror of his brothers in that split second. The brother they condemned to slavery, the blood on their hands, is now the most powerful man on the face of the earth. He can have them executed with a blink of an eye. They are completely at his mercy.
But Joseph doesn't call the executioners. He forgives them. He embraces them. And in doing so, he delivers what I believe is the theological peak of the entire book of Genesis. It's found in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20.
He looks at his trembling brothers and he says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today."
You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. I want every listener to let that phrase sink into your bones. This is the ultimate anchor for anyone facing tragedy, injustice, or suffering.
It is the Bible's clearest, most profound statement on the doctrine of divine providence. And I want you to notice the specific verb Joseph uses. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, you meant it for evil, but God turned it to good, as if God was caught off guard by their sin and had to scramble to enact a plan B. He says God meant it for good. God intended it.
That's a heavy concept. Are you saying God authored the evil of the brothers?
Not at all. The brothers acted entirely out of their own free will, out of their own jealousy and malice. They are fully culpable for their sin. But God's sovereign providence is so infinitely massive, so utterly outside of our temporal limitations, that he does not merely react to human sin. He providentially orchestrates human failure, betrayal, and tragedy, incorporating the free choices of wicked men to accomplish his ultimate plan of salvation without ever violating their free will or being the author of the evil itself.
God factored their betrayal into the rescue plan. From the violence of the pit, to the false accusations in the bedroom, to the despair of the prison, God was steering the ship through the storm of human malice to get Joseph to the palace at the exact moment the world needed a savior.
Which perfectly mirrors the cross. The betrayal of Jesus, the unjust trial, the crucifixion, these were acts of profound human evil. Yet Acts chapter 2 says Jesus was delivered up by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. The greatest evil in human history was the very mechanism God meant for the greatest good, the salvation of the world.
It's all connected. From the macro creation of the universe out of nothing in Genesis 1 to the intimate, tear-soaked reconciliation of a broken, toxic family in Genesis 50, the book sets the stage for absolutely everything that follows in human history.
Which brings us to the close of our deep dive today. Let's summarize the immense ground we've covered. Our primary takeaway is that the book of Genesis is absolutely not a collection of disconnected ancient campfire myths. It is an intensely integrated, highly sophisticated architectural blueprint.
It gives us the intellectual framework to reject false modern philosophies, whether it's atheism, materialism, or unguided evolution, right from the very first verse. It provides the gritty, unvarnished honesty to see our own flaws and struggles mirrored in men like Abraham and Jacob. It teaches us that authentic faith isn't about perfection. It's a messy, lifelong journey of burying our idols and learning absolute dependence on grace.
And, perhaps most awe-inspiring for the reader, it allows us to see the vivid shadow of Jesus Christ cast across the text thousands of years in advance. From the wood carried up Mount Moriah, to the bloody animal skins in Eden, to the life, betrayal, and exaltation of Joseph.
It is a message system of unparalleled design, stamped with the watermark of a creator who operates entirely outside of time. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to ponder as you go about your week. The Bible begins here in Genesis with a garden. A man and a woman rebel, sin enters the world, and they are driven out. And as they leave, access to the tree of life is blocked by a cherubim wielding a flaming sword.
The ultimate closed door. Paradise is lost, and humanity is exiled into the wilderness.
But if you skip to the very back of the book, the Bible ends, in the book of Revelation, with a new creation, a city descending from heaven, where the text specifically notes that the gates are never shut. And standing in the middle of the city is the tree of life, freely available for the healing of the nations.
The devastating conflict introduced in the very first chapters of the first book is explicitly, perfectly resolved in the final chapters of the final book.
Exactly. Penned by dozens of different authors, living on different continents, writing in different languages, spread over thousands of years of human history. If the first book perfectly sets up the conflicts that are explicitly resolved in the final book, what does that tell you about the true author's relationship with time itself? It's something to think about as you navigate the complexities of your own timeline today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Join us every week on The Story Behind Scripture, where we deep dive a book of the Bible or a unique lesson to see how the Word of God always points to the Son of God, Jesus Christ. You can also check out the story of the destruction of Solomon's temple, tracing the historical events through the prophets, the changing world empires, and how it all points to the coming king. Written in Fire by Mike Benitez is available on Amazon. Link is in the comments.